Cary Wolfe's book, Zoontologies, suggests that the existence of non-human entities, referred to as animals, raises profound philosophical and ethical inquiries that penetrate the very core of our beliefs and identity. The discussion on animality and species, as presented in the introduction, highlights the significant impact of this discourse on non-human animals. It sheds light on our ingrained practices of using and exploiting them, with consequences that weigh heavily on their well-being. Wolfe maintains his focus not only on addressing non-human animals, but also on delving into the dynamics between these discourses and the living creatures that fall beyond the boundaries of Homo sapiens' taxonomy. Consequently, he establishes a dichotomy between what he terms the ontological and the linguistic or textual animal. However, a pressing question arises. Why must we insist on this division? Why must we assert that real animals are not socially constructed through discursive and linguistic construct, when they are undeniably brought into existence through a range of human activities? These include breeding programs that supply animals for various purposes, whether as companions for factory farming or for laboratory research, as well as stringent preservationist regulations governing the presence of animals in national parks and zoos. Many of the essays within this collection suggest more nuanced perspectives on these issues. Nonetheless, the volume ultimately feels somewhat limited in its exploration of what Wolfe deems perhaps the central problematic for contemporary culture and theory. Derrida's essay, And Say the Animal Responded, interrogates Lacan's understanding of animal. Derrida's objective is to break free from the Cartesian notion of the animal as a mere machine, devoid of language and the capacity to respond. He finds particular significance in discerning the distinction between response and reaction in animals, where reaction is often linked to pure instinct. This difference serves as a fruitful ground for delving into a range of theoretical considerations that have conventionally demarcated the boundary between the human and the animal. Derrida also scrutinizes other conceptual spaces, such as the nuances between pretense and the act of pretending to pretend, as well as between leaving a trace and erasing one. Throughout his work, Derrida takes issue with the problematic insistence on the term the animal, a concern echoed in much of Wolfe's own scholarship. To grapple with these complexities, Derrida introduces the neologism vanimote to open up a space of questioning. While the elaboration of this term is more explicit in Derrida's work, The Animal That Therefore I Am, it also serves to clarify his ethical stance. However, Derrida offers enough cautions to leave one pondering whether he ever truly engages with what we might consider real animals. On one hand, Derrida acknowledges that certain species are currently facing annihilation, but he emphasizes that this occurs through the orchestrated and exploitative mechanisms of an artificial, nightmarish, nearly endless survival in conditions that earlier generations would have deemed monstrous and far removed from any presumed norm of life befitting these animals. On the other hand, he ridicules those who would deny the ontological distinction between humans and animals, emphasizing that he has never subscribed to the notion of a homogeneous continuity between what identifies as human and what he refers to as the animal. He contends that such a belief would be more absurd than sleepwalking. It would be downright obtuse. Instead, he advocates for a recognition of the multiple and heterogeneous border of this abyssal rupture. Steve Baker's piece is intriguing in its exploration of contemporary visual artists who are focused on sloughing the human, the central theme of his work. He briefly touches on theoretical concepts from Deleuze, Guattari, and Heidegger as discussed by Derrida, before delving into a survey of captivating art. For instance, he discusses Joseph Bayus's 1974 performance involving an improvised encounter with a live coyote named Little John, as well as John Isaac's 1995 sculpture featuring a chimpanzee with human-like hands that are intentionally and conspicuously distinct from the rest of the figures. However, beyond characterizing this creation as particularly disturbing, Baker offers relatively little in-depth analysis. Ursula K. Hayes' essay also presents thought-provoking points, juxtaposing the plight of endangered species with various forms of cyborg animals in contemporary American culture. She argues that the extinction of actual animal species profoundly influences how artificial animal forms are approached and assessed. Hayes cites examples such as Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park, Thomas Ray's computer-based artificial life project, Tierra, and Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, each of which could warrant in-depth character-length studies. Yet Hayes is more concerned with making the overarching point that cyborg creatures can impart valuable lessons about real animals. This distinction prompts us to consider the theoretical potential in acknowledging that all animals could be viewed as cyborg to some extent, particularly if we recognize that our interaction with and representation of them are shaped by human language and the structures of power and discourse, encompassing the broader notion of the unnatural within the cyborg concept. The idea of constructing real animals raises questions about the biological underpinnings of behavior, a foundation that has been thoroughly deconstructed in terms of human biological determinism in the last 30 years of literary theory. Some essays in this collection seem to rely on a somewhat static notion of what is considered natural for animals, as well as simplistic dichotomy between real nature and animality in both humans and non-humans, and cultural construction. For example, Judith Roof's piece, which connects Freud's study of microscopic organisms with contemporary DNA studies, suggests that Freud's observations are more constructed and thus less subjective compared to recent efforts to define what is natural through DNA. The centrality of Freud and his role in shaping perceptions of the animal, particularly in the broader context raised by this collection, appears pivotal. Alfonso Lynges, in his experimental piece titled Animal Body in Human Face, initially seems to resist constructs of what is natural or biologically determined. He calls for a form of omnisexuality in prose reminiscent of Whitman, objecting to the notion that the human libido naturally leads to us to a member of our species and of the opposite sex. He then illustrates a conception of desire and pleasure that can encompass human-animal relationships. However, the accelerating sense of animal irresponsibility he subsequently advocates is fundamentally at odds with the machinic and social environment and the inhuman phase of culture that regulates passion and carnality. This leaves us with the implication that the animal must represent the absence of culture, a pre-lapsarian biological state that can be invoked as a remedy for the perceived ills of civilization. In Paul Patton's piece on language power and the training of horses, the interspecies relations discussed lack a distinct libidinal intensity. However, Patton's contribution stands out for its commendable willingness to acknowledge the power dynamics inherent in our interactions with animals. By focusing on a specific animal, the horse, and a specific training method, dressage, Patton grapples with the question of whether a trainer can ever engage with a trainee in ways that are fundamentally coercive. He examines the work of Vicky Hearn, author of Adam's Task, Calling Animals by Name, and Monty Roberts, author of The Man Who Listens to Horses. Patton concurs that conventional training methods can be unduly harsh and unnecessary. Yet he hesitates to suggest that the inherent power imbalances can be entirely eliminated. It would also be beneficial to consider the class disparities likely generated through the training of horses for dressage. This broader connection to shifting and often contradictory human social issues is a theme that remains somewhat marginalized throughout much of the collection. Charlie Laduff's contribution at the end of the volume appears to attempt an address of this issue, as it chronicles the oppressive racial hierarchies observed among the workers at a North Carolina slaughterhouse. Laduff notes that few whites on the payroll tend to be mechanics or supervisors. As for the Indians, a handful of supervisors, others tend to get clean menial jobs like warehouse work. With few exceptions, that leaves the blacks and Mexicans with the dirty jobs at the factory. The piece shows little, if any, concern for the animals being slaughtered, except to imply that it is unjust to treat workers the way animals are treated. Yet, what would a post-humanist ethical pluralism look like in this context? Wolfe's gloss on the piece in his introduction initially highlights the illegal immigrants earn $8 or $9 an hour, then swiftly transitions to the staggering statistic that this company alone slaughters 19 million animals each year. However, proposing a direct link between these forms of oppression and recalling Wolfe's assertion that the institution of speciesism leads to disproportionate consequences for non-human animals might seem somewhat limiting in this case.